The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, Episode 7, the penultimate episode of Season 1, the aftermath of the eruption of Mount Doom and the creation of the land of Mordor. The biggest question I had going into this episode was, can it match last week's one, the Battle of the Southlands, which I think was hands down the best episode so far, whereas Episode 7, The Eye, unfortunately it's a mixed bag. Of course, I'll give you guys a quick spoiler warning for Episode 7, but I felt most of the 70 minutes of this episode was just them treading water. The marketing was all focused around Sauron, the Stranger, the Mystics, but all of that is happening in the final episode. This episode was so slow, and very little happens outside of Khazad-dûm. Almost everything of the Dwarfs is 10 out of 10 for me. Durin is the heart of this series. And of course Disa and King Durin as well. Major secondary characters that are always welcome. Just give me an episode 1 hour long of them. The Dwarfs are by far the best part of the show. But that Balrog scene was absolutely awful. It's pulled straight from the trailer, it adds very little, and it's so on the nose. And several other parts of this episode were just clear winks at the camera. And I feel my biggest complaint for this series are the writing and the pacing. I honestly believe they laid out the 8 episodes, and they wanted all the big reveals in the finale. The Balrog, the Mystics, the Stranger, and more importantly, who Sauron is. But they had to fill in the gaps to get there, and I think they filled it up with a lot of silly and pointless scenes. Multiple fake-out deaths, especially with Bronwyn, let's get over that. Or even stuff taken straight from Peter Jackson's movies. For example, Isildur is missing, but we know he can't die because he has to cut the ring from Sauron's hand. And that's fine. This always happens in prequels, when a character who is meant to survive is put in danger. But sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes it even develops the character. But I don't think it's going to play it well. What they're going to do is Beric has ran off, and he is going to find Isildur, and we're going to get an Aragorn and Brago scene from Two Towers, where the horse saves his life. It's obviously not happened yet, but all the signs are there. It honestly reminds me of Tauriel in The Desolation of Smaug, when it's a clear rip-off of Arwen coming to save Frodo. Like I said, it's not happened yet, but it seems so obvious. And it might play out well, but I have my doubts. And honestly, most of the stuff in the Southlands just did not resonate with me this week. Galadriel and Theo is a very interesting pairing, and I didn't mind what was going on until the Celeborn name drop. Galadriel reveals they are married, but he went off to war and never came back. And I think he is still alive, he is just missing, and she presumes that he's dead. But he'll come back in Season 2, or maybe Season 3. Celeborn and Círdan and Glorfindel, all these important characters are currently missing, but they'll turn up eventually. But I feel with Celeborn, he's only missing so that Galadriel can go off and hunt Sauron. I will admit Galadriel is getting better, but I think the reimagining of her character is the weakest part of this show. Obviously they can't change anything for next week, for the finale, but they can for Season 2. But honestly, I just felt this episode was like treading water. It's hyping up what's to come in Episode 8, and it's filling the gaps to get there, but nothing really happens. The Dwarfs, for me, were really the only saving grace. The Harfoot stuff wasn't that bad, but it's moved at such a snail pace, this could have all been dealt with in half the time. It's great the Mystics have finally caught up with them, and they're on the Stranger's tail, and now Nori is leading her fellowship to find him first. And it looks like he's heading off to Greenwood the Great, which will later be known as Mirkwood. And this is where he's likely going to fight the Mystics. They'll probably get the upper hand on him because there's 3 of them, but somehow the Harfoots will save him. And I suppose this could make for a very interesting spectacle, as both sides are magical. We've always felt they're evil, especially after blowing up the Harfoots' caravans, and there's theories they're hunting the Stranger on behalf of Sauron, because he's the only being that could oppose the Dark Lord. But there's also theories they're looking for Sauron to restore him somehow and mixed him up with the Stranger. But guys, I think it's 100% certain now that Halbrand is Sauron. He's on his way to Lindon on the Middle-earth Express of Galadriel, and it seems so very convenient that his wound needs elven healing. So will Sauron reveal himself in Lindon? Or will they stop off in Eregion, because Gil-galad is hanging around with Celebrimbor there? And this is where he manipulates Celebrimbor, after showing off his abilities as a blacksmith. Of course, we gotta talk about the rights issues. Amazon have the rights to the Lord of the Rings and the appendices, and I believe the name Anatar, which is the name that Sauron used to trick the elves, only appears in the Silmarillion. That's not in the appendices, so they can't use that name. Amazon have made compromises with the estate before, such as elements of Numenor like the map and the name of the capital city, but I think the story of Anatar from the books and Halbrand on the show will be very, very different. Perhaps they just couldn't come to an agreement, maybe they wanted to change the story up. But no matter what, Gil-galad was right. Galadriel is the reason for evil's return, and those seeds of romance that Amazon have clearly planted will make for an interesting reveal. And speaking of reveals, the Mordor reveal, one of the worst things I've ever seen on television. It honestly felt like somebody went in at post-production after a note was given to the writers from Amazon. Amazon felt that the audience wouldn't realise this is Mordor, so they had to have the name appear on screen. They honestly should have just left it with Adar smiling and then cut to Mount Doom, and that's it. And it also seems like Adar is making it to Season 2, unless Sauron takes the Middle-earth Express back to Mordor and kills him, and then takes over Mordor. But then how long is it going to take to build Barad-dûr? What magic MacGuffin can they come up with this time? To build a several 1,000-foot tower that took Sauron centuries. The time compression and the pacing, the world and the scale just feel so small, and it's getting quite ridiculous at this point. But yes, Numenor will return to Middle-earth. Miriel has lost her sight, but she's promised to come back to finish the job, and no doubt Pharazôn will use her blindness to take over, become king, and we get the real armada that forces Sauron to surrender. I hate being negative. I want this show to succeed. Episode 6 was a breath of fresh air. It's not perfect, but I think it's the best episode by far, and it's honestly a decent bit of television. But this, not a fan, and we'll have to see what happens in the finale. Before this episode aired, they already promised a trailer for episode 8, with dialogue from the Mystics talking about Sauron. It's almost like Amazon knew this episode would be filler, and they had to get through it to reach episode 8. We have Sauron, the Mystics, the Stranger, all the best parts of the show supposedly. Let's hope it finishes strong, and we can look forward and positively into Season 2. But guys, I want you to post your thoughts. I know some of you guys will love this episode, some of you guys will loathe it. I'm somewhere in the middle, but if you took the Dwarfs out, I honestly don't know how I'd rate this episode. But it would definitely be on the lower end of the scale. Okay, so my next video is going to be a trailer breakdown for His Dark Material Season 3. They dropped the trailer for the final season at New York Comic Con on Friday, but of course I had to get Lord of the Rings done first, and I want to spend a bit of time making sure that video is as good as it can be, so expect that some point on Sunday. In case you don't know, His Dark Materials is coming out in December, and it's a big part for this channel. I've got videos on Season 1 and Season 2 for you guys to check out. And of course, it's the big one on Sunday, House of the Dragon Episode 8. The time skips are done now, the permanent actors are in place, and the Dance of the Dragons is just around the corner. And then of course, Rings of Power finale on Friday. So I'll say thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.